The secret British weapon buried underground for decades. June 6, 1944. The Normandy coast. The largest amphibious invasion in the history of human warfare is already 12 hours old, and it is already running dry. Not of men, not of courage, not of ammunition or artillery or the grim industrial will to press forward into machine gun fire. No, it is running dry of petrol, the lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare, the fuel that keeps tanks rolling, aircraft screaming across the sky, and lorries grinding forward along roads not yet wrested from German control. By nightfall, on that first extraordinary day, Allied planners are already staring at calculations that should terrify them. Every Sherman tank, every Spitfire, every DUKWamphibious vehicle grinding up the sand at Utah and Omaha requires a relentless, unbroken river of fuel simply to exist. And that fuel must cross 22 miles of the English Channel, in steel drums loaded by hand, shifted by small boats into an ocean that, even in June, offers no guarantees of calm. The logisticians know something the soldiers do not. They know that the invasion cannot be won on the beaches. The invasion will be won, or lost, in the weeks that follow, in the grinding push through the bocage country of Normandy, towards Paris, towards the Rhine, towards Berlin itself. And to win that grinding push, the Allied armies will need not thousands of gallons of petrol, not hundreds of thousands, but millions upon millions of gallons, delivered continuously, reliably, and faster than any convoy of ships can manage in any weather the Channel chooses to inflict. They know all of this, and, remarkably, they have already prepared for it. Somewhere beneath the gray-green waters of the English Channel, coiled and waiting, is the most audacious piece of engineering the war has yet produced. Not a bomb, not a gun, not a vehicle or a weapon in the conventional sense. Something stranger, more patient, and in its quiet way more consequential than almost anything else the British war machine has contrived. It is a pipeline running under the ocean itself, 22 miles of steel and lead, lying on the seabed, invisible to enemy reconnaissance, impervious to air attack, waiting for the moment when it will be switched on and begin pumping the fuel that will drive the liberation of Western Europe. The men who built it called it Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, and for decades after the war ended, almost nobody knew it existed. To understand why Pluto was necessary, it helps to understand just how catastrophically inadequate the alternatives were. Modern armies in the Second World War consumed petrol at a rate that would have been unimaginable to any general of the previous century. A single armored division, roughly 15,000 men and their associated vehicles, required approximately 60,000 gallons of petrol per day simply to maintain operational tempo, not to advance aggressively, not to fight intensively, simply to exist and move at a moderate pace. Multiply that across the dozens of divisions that would eventually be committed to the Normandy campaign, and the figure becomes staggering. By the time the Allied breakout from Normandy was in full swing in August 1944, General George Patton's Third Army alone was consuming roughly 400,000 gallons of petrol every single day. Now consider how that fuel had to be delivered in the absence of any pipeline. It had to be pumped into containers in England. Those containers had to be loaded onto ships. Those ships had to cross the Channel, which is subject to storms, tides, and the attentions of the Luftwaffe and the German Navy. On arrival off the Normandy coast, the ships had to be unloaded, either by small craft ferrying drums ashore or by offloading into the extraordinary Mulberry harbors, those prefabricated floating ports that were themselves one of the engineering marvels of the war. Each step in this chain was slow, weather-dependent, and vulnerable. A severe Channel storm, and the Channel produces them regularly, even in summer, could shut down fuel deliveries for days at a time. In late June 1944, a storm lasting 3 days destroyed one of the 2 Mulberry harbors entirely and set back Allied supply operations by weeks. The planners at the War Office and the Petroleum Warfare Department had been aware of this vulnerability long before D-Day. As early as 1942, an engineer named Arthur Hartley, working for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, had proposed the seemingly outlandish idea of a flexible pipeline that could be laid on the seabed of the channel. His concept was not greeted with immediate enthusiasm. The notion of building a pipe 22 miles long, capable of surviving the pressures of the seabed, the corrosive action of salt water, the possibility of trawler nets and German sabotage, and the technical challenge of pumping highly flammable aviation fuel and motor spirit over that distance, he saw, it seemed to more cautious minds, like the kind of idea that sounded magnificent in a briefing room and fell apart on contact with engineering reality. What Hartley and his colleagues understood, however, was that the alternative was potentially losing the war through logistics rather than combat. And so, with the quiet intensity that characterized the best British wartime engineering, they began to work. The project that emerged was overseen by the Petroleum Warfare Department, a body that itself barely existed in public consciousness. The PWD had been established in 1940, initially to investigate the use of oil and flame as weapons of defense, the so-called flame fugace, burning oil barriers designed to repel a German beach landing. By the time serious planning for Pluto began in earnest in 1942, the department had evolved into something considerably more ambitious, a specialist organization capable of translating radical engineering proposals into operational hardware. Two distinct pipeline designs were developed in parallel because the engineers were honest enough to acknowledge that neither might work perfectly, and the consequences of failure were unacceptable. The first design was called HAIS, an acronym derived from the names of its principal developers, Hartley, Anglo-Iranian, and Siemens. The HAIS pipe was built on the same basic principle as a submarine telegraph cable, which had been successfully laid on the seabed for nearly a century. At its core was a central lead pipe, approximately 3 inches, roughly 76 millimeters, in diameter. Around this lead pipe was wound a layer of steel wire tape for mechanical strength, followed by paper insulation, then an outer sheath of steel wires arranged in a helical pattern, and finally a jute serving, layers of tarred yarn that provided both additional protection and a degree of flexibility. The completed HAIS pipe was roughly 4 inches in diameter and weighed approximately 55 pounds per yard, roughly 25 kilograms per meter. It was, in essence, a very large, very expensive version of the armored cable you might find carrying electricity into a large building, except that instead of carrying electricity, it would carry fuel at high pressure, and instead of being buried in a trench, it would be lying on the floor of the English Channel. The second design was called Hamel, after its inventors Hammock and Ellis. Where HAIS was a lead-in steel construction, Hamel was built from mild steel pipe, approximately 3 inches in diameter, wound onto enormous floating drums so large that they became known as cotton reels, and for good reason. Each cotton reel was roughly 90 feet, 27 meters in diameter, and could carry 40 miles, 64 kilometers of pipeline. To put that in some kind of human scale, one of these drums was taller than a 5-story building, weighed somewhere in the region of 1,600 tons when fully loaded, and had to be towed across the channel by a pair of ocean-going tugs at a speed slow enough to allow the pipe to unroll cleanly and sink to the seabed without kinking. The sound of Hamel pipe paying out from its drum was described by those who witnessed it as a continuous, low-pitched metallic groan, punctuated by occasional sharp clangs as sections of pipe snapped taut. The manufacture of the pipeline was distributed across Britain for both practical and security reasons. Cables were produced in Birmingham, at the works of companies more accustomed to making industrial cable for power networks. Lead was drawn from Welsh smelters. The great cotton reel drums were fabricated at shipyards on the Clyde and the Tyne. At the pumping stations that would eventually push fuel through the pipeline, Converted steam engines and purpose-built electric pumps were installed in purpose-built facilities, disguised, wherever possible, as ordinary farm buildings or industrial units. The whole enterprise at its peak employed thousands of people, most of whom knew only their small piece of the puzzle. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. There is a great deal more history like this waiting to be told. The initial Pluto operations began not across the Channel to Normandy, but in a more modest proving ground, the 40-mile crossing from Sandown Bay on the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, which the Allies had captured in late June 1944. The first HAIS cable was laid in August 1944, and it failed almost immediately. A combination of seabed damage and pumping difficulties that produced flow rates far below what had been promised. A second HAIS line was laid in September. That, too, encountered problems. The project that had been promised as a logistical revolution was, in its early weeks, delivering far less than a single tanker. The engineers did not abandon it. They diagnosed the problems with meticulous care, modified the pumping pressures, repaired damaged sections, and persisted. By the end of 1944, 2 HAIS lines and 1 Hamel line were operational between the Isle of Wight and Cherbourg, delivering an improving but still modest flow. Somewhere in the region of 300 tons of fuel per day was passing through the system, a fraction of what had been hoped, but proof that the principle was sound. The real transformation came in early 1945 with the construction of a second, shorter pipeline route, the crossing from Dungeness in Kent to Boulogne, a distance of only about 30 miles. Here, the combination of improved techniques, better understanding of seabed conditions, and greater operational experience produced results of an entirely different order. By March 1945, 17 parallel pipelines were operational on the Dungeness-Boulogne route. By the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, Pluto was delivering an average of approximately 1 million gallons, roughly 4,500 tons each of petrol and aviation fuel per day. Over the course of the campaign, the system delivered in the region of 172 million gallons of fuel to the advancing Allied armies. Not a modest contribution, not a technical curiosity, a fundamental piece of the infrastructure that kept those armies moving. The men who operated the pumping stations along the English coast worked in conditions that were both mundane and secretly extraordinary. One such station at Sandown on the Isle of Wight was disguised as an ice cream factory, complete with a fake shopfront and the nominal production of a small quantity of ice cream, sufficient to deflect the curiosity of local residents who might otherwise wonder what was being pumped in such quantities into the sea. Similar disguises were employed at other stations, a garage here, a water pumping facility there. The Germans, for all their considerable intelligence-gathering capability, never identified Pluto as a significant target. It is instructive to compare Pluto with what the Germans were doing, and more pertinently, with what the Americans were attempting, in the same period. The Germans, for all their engineering sophistication, had no equivalent system in place for supplying fuel across large bodies of water in the manner Pluto achieved. German fuel logistics across the Channel was never a problem they had to solve, for the obvious reason that they never successfully invaded Britain. Their pipeline infrastructure on the continent was substantial and often technically impressive, particularly in the early war years, but it was designed for overland operation in territory they controlled. When that territory was contested, as it increasingly was from 1943 onwards, the vulnerability of above-ground pipeline infrastructure to air attack became catastrophically apparent. RAF and USAAF bombing raids on German synthetic oil facilities and pipeline networks from mid-1944 onwards contributed significantly to the Wehrmacht's progressive fuel starvation. The Americans were simultaneously working on their own cross-channel fuel delivery solutions, principally through the use of tankers and the construction of conventional shore-based pipeline infrastructure in Normandy. American engineering in this period was characterized by a preference for scale and speed over technical innovation. The American approach was essentially to build more of what already existed, faster than the Germans could destroy it. This produced impressive results, but it was vulnerable in a way that Pluto was not. A USAAF tanker sunk in the Channel was a visible, replaceable loss. A pipeline on the seabed was invisible and virtually indestructible by any means the Germans had available to them. The Soviets, interestingly, had experimented with underwater pipeline technology in their own theater of operations, most notably a pipeline under Lake Ladoga, near Leningrad, which supplied the besieged city during the winter of 1941 to 1942. The Soviet pipeline was a more rudimentary construction than Pluto, laid under emergency conditions and carrying a smaller volume of fuel. It was nonetheless a remarkable achievement, and it suggests that the underlying idea of underwater fuel transport was occurring independently to engineers in very different contexts at very similar times, a phenomenon common enough in the history of technology to have its own name: simultaneous invention. The legacy of Pluto is a complicated thing to assess. At the level of cold statistics, its direct contribution to fuel supply in the Normandy campaign was real, but perhaps smaller than its planners had hoped. The pipeline never delivered the 10 million gallons per day that some estimates had promised, and in the crucial early weeks after D-Day, when fuel supply was most desperately needed, it was not yet operational. The tanker convoys and the laborious drum and ferry system continued to do much of the heavy lifting well into the autumn of 1944. Yet, to dismiss Pluto on those grounds is to miss something important. The 17 parallel lines that were eventually operational on the Dungeness-Boulogne route represented a supply rate that no surface convoy could match in terms of reliability, security, and weather independence. In the final months of the war, when the Allied advance was moving at extraordinary speed across France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, fuel supply was the single most critical constraint on operations. The failure to keep Patton's Third Army supplied with fuel contributed directly to the controversial halt of the Allied advance in September 1944, a halt that some historians argue prolonged the war by months. In that context, every gallon that Pluto delivered was not merely fuel. It was time. It was momentum. It was lives. The pipeline also established a technical precedent of remarkable durability. The engineering knowledge accumulated during Pluto's design and construction fed directly into the post-war development of offshore oil and gas infrastructure. The flexible armored pipe that had carried aviation fuel across the seabed of the English Channel was the direct ancestor of the subsea pipelines that today carry natural gas from North Sea fields to the British mainland. In that sense, every time a British household turns on a gas hob, there is a faint, attenuated connection to the engineers who were working in the shadow of invasion in 1942, trying to solve what seemed an impossible problem. Physical evidence of Pluto is sparse, as befits a system designed to be invisible. A small museum on the Isle of Wight at Shanklin Chine preserves sections of HAIS cable and some of the pumping equipment from the Sandown station. In France, occasional sections of pipe have been recovered from the seabed and are held in local museums. The concrete pump houses along the Kent and Sussex coast have largely been demolished or absorbed into other structures. For a project that once delivered 1 million gallons of fuel a day, it has left remarkably little trace. Return, for a moment, to that beach in Normandy. The morning of June 7, 1944, the second day of the invasion. The tanks are ashore. The infantry are pushing inland. The fuel drums are being offloaded by hand from small craft rocking in a channel swell, and every man handling them knows that this system is inadequate, that somewhere ahead, when the advance accelerates, the fuel will run short, and the tanks will stop, and men will die waiting for supply. They do not know about Pluto. They do not know that beneath the gray water through which their landing craft have just passed, engineers are already preparing to thread a pipeline under the ocean itself. They do not know that the men who sent them here were also, simultaneously, solving the problem of how to keep them supplied, not with improvisation and goodwill, but with careful, secret, premeditated engineering on a scale the world had never attempted. This is what Pluto represents. Not merely a piece of hardware, not merely a logistical solution. It represents a certain quality of mind, the quality that looks at an impossible problem and begins, quietly and without fanfare, to solve it. The quality that accepts that the most dramatic moments of history are often supported by the least dramatic preparations. The beach landings at Normandy were filmed, photographed, witnessed, and described in 10,000 accounts. The engineers who laid the pipeline that supplied those landings worked in disguised ice cream factories and fake garages, in the middle of the night, watched by nobody. Their work went on beneath the surface, quite literally, and when the war was over, it went back beneath the surface again, classified, forgotten, known only to those who had made it. It took decades for the full story to emerge. It took the declassification of wartime documents, the patient work of archivists and historians, and the testimony of aging engineers who were finally permitted to describe what they had done. When it did emerge, it arrived not with the fanfare of a battle won or a city liberated, but with the quieter, stranger satisfaction of something long buried, finally brought to light. 22 miles of pipe on the floor of the channel, 1 million gallons a day, and, for decades, not a word. That is what won the war from underneath.